Today we're going to do a broad overview of stress, including the 6 key moments in stress history. I'll give you a broad definition of stress, although I doubt any of you really need one. There's actually a famous quote about pornography from some congressional hearing where someone was asked to define pornography and he simply said that he couldn't define it, but he knew it when he saw it. Stress is a lot like that for many people, and for a long time, it was like that for a lot of researchers. Nobody was quite certain how to define it, and different researchers defined it in different ways. This is a pretty reasonable definition for stress. Stress is a negative emotional experience accompanied by predictable biochemical, physiological, cognitive, and behavioral changes that are directed either toward altering the stressful event or accommodating to its effects. To unpack that slightly, that's kind of a complicated definition of stress. We can just think of stress as something that feels bad. It doesn't feel good. It's also accompanied by biochemical and physiological changes. We'll talk about those mainly in the next video. In addition, in the next video, we'll talk about what stress does to your body. Stress also leads to cognitive and behavioral changes. You might think certain thoughts or behave in certain ways to either change the event or to get used to the stressful event. So before we go any further, just take a moment to think about the kinds of things that might stress out humans versus the kinds of things that might stress out animals. And I'll just give you a few seconds to think about those things. Stressors have been categorized based on whether they're physical or psychological. As we hopefully just demonstrated with this last example, physical stressors are stressors that all animals would find stressful, things such as heat, cold, pain, hunger, thirst, whereas psychological stressors are stressors generally only humans would find stressful, such as getting good grades or maintaining healthy relationships or meeting deadlines at work. Stressors have also been categorized based on how long they last. Acute stressors are those that demand immediate attention and that don't last very long. Most physical stressors are acute stressors. Chronic stressors, on the other hand, are those that don't require immediate attention, but they can last a very long time and thus can be a source of constant worry. Most psychological stressors tend to be chronic in nature. So an example of an acute physical stressor would be being chased by a mugger or being approached by some kind of predator and being scared. It's a very short-term threat to our physical selves. An example of a chronic physical stressor would be something like being in the middle of a drought or a famine and constantly having to worry for months at a time about where your next meal or glass of water is going to come from. Although most psychological stressors are chronic in nature, it's possible for psychological stressors to be acute in nature. An example of this would be being presented with a pop quiz or shooting free throws at a basketball game. And as I've already alluded to, chronic psychological stressors are much more common than acute psychological stressors. These would be studying for a big exam, or just generally stressing out at work, trying to meet everything that's expected of you by your boss. Now we're going to move on and go over the highlights of the history of the study of stress. We'll start with the first moment in this history with Walter Cannon and his discovery of the fight or flight response. Walter Cannon was a physiologist who was interested in the physiological reaction people have and animals have in response to danger in their world. In the 1920s, he argued that when a person or animal perceives a threat in the world, their body has this very specific physiological response. More specifically, their autonomic nervous system becomes activated. This, in turn, helps mobilize the person or animal to either attack the threat or flee from the threat. Unsurprisingly, he called this the fight or flight response. He said that this response is useful because it helps you respond quickly to a threat, but that this is also potentially harmful because it disrupts the normal functioning of the person or animal. We'll talk more about these beneficial and potentially harmful changes to your body during stress in the next video. The second moment in the history of the study of stress involved Hans Selye and his accidental discovery of stress itself. Hans Selye is known as the father of stress, and in 1956 he published a hugely influential book called The Stress of Life. Selye inadvertently came upon the study of stress, as is often the case in science. He was an endocrinologist, so somebody who specializes in studying hormones and their effects. He was studying a new ovarian extract to see what it would do to a body. So he did this by injecting rats with this ovarian extract daily to see what it would do. Unfortunately, Hans was pretty inept when it came to handling his rats, so in his daily attempts to inject this hormone into the rats, he would try to pick one up, he'd take it out of the cage, but then he'd drop it, and the poor rat would run all over the lab, and Hans would chase it around. He'd finally trap it, put it back in the box, and then inject it with this hormone. And obviously, this was quite an ordeal for both Hans and his rats. And throughout the course of his study, he never really learned to handle his rats any better. His inept handling of the rats continued throughout the duration of his study, which lasted for a few months. At the end of the study, he examined his rats and found 3 interesting symptoms that all of his rats showed. First, he found all of his rats had enlarged adrenal glands. Second, he found that they all had shrunken lymph nodes. And then finally, he found that all of his rats had bleeding ulcers. And he was very excited about this. In his mind, the ovarian extract must have caused this constellation of symptoms. So Hans had discovered a new illness caused by ovarian extract, and he figured he could publish this fascinating news, and his career would essentially be made. He'd be set for life. But he was a smart guy. He was a scientist, so he knew that he needed a control group. So he did the exact same procedure, but this time he injected his rats with saline solution rather than the ovarian extract he injected into his previous group of rats. And of course, he didn't get any better at handling his rats. He was still quite clumsy, dropping them, chasing them, finally trapping them, and then giving them shots. And at the end of several months, he examined these rats and found probably something that you already expect, the same exact constellation of symptoms. All of these rats had enlarged adrenal glands, shrunken lymph nodes, and bleeding ulcers. And Hans was pretty upset about this. The rats in the control group were showing the exact same constellation of symptoms as the rats in his experimental group. So apparently the story goes that he just sat in his lab for a few days, so distressed that he just couldn't bring himself to do any more work. Here he was, riding high, thinking his career was going to be made due to the discovery of his new ovarian extract disease. But because he got the same constellation of symptoms after injecting rats with saline solution, again, if you don't know, saline solution is essentially just salt water, there was clearly nothing special about the ovarian extract. But then, as it happens for most brilliant or lucky scientists at least, he had his eureka moment. He suddenly realized that the only thing his two groups had in common was his clumsy handling, and he thought perhaps the symptoms he found were some sort of response to general unpleasantness, which he described as a noxious agent, this unpleasant stimuli. So he tested his new theory. He put a new group of rats on his roof during the winter, another group of rats in the boiler room during the summer. He forced some to exercise, whereas he performed surgeries on other groups of rats. And no matter what he did to these rats, after a few months he found the same constellation of symptoms: enlarged adrenal glands, shrunken lymph nodes, and bleeding ulcers. In fact, he couldn't find a single noxious agent that didn't produce this constellation of symptoms. So he concluded that all animals, including humans, will demonstrate these symptoms in response to some kind of noxious agent. Now, the story is that he didn't have a word to use for this kind of demand caused by these noxious agents, so he borrowed a word from physics that described a force on an object: stress. So he basically, after discovering this constellation of symptoms, he wanted to name it, so he named it the General Adaptation Syndrome, which is a non-specific response of the body to any demand placed on it. By non-specific, what we mean is that the body's response is the same no matter what the stressor is. This was a novel idea at the time because everybody back then thought that each demand had its own specific, unique response. So what is the General Adaptation Syndrome? Well, Hans argued that there are 3 phases to it. The first stage is alarm. This stage is a lot like Cannon's fight-or-flight response. The function of this stage is to mobilize the entire body's resources by increasing physiological arousal. This increased arousal is a result of the endocrine system releasing a whole lot of hormones, in particular epinephrine, or as you might know it, adrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol. And these are all released by the adrenal glands. And all of these hormones, all these chemicals, help your body to mobilize its energy for a certain stressor. The second stage of this general adaptation syndrome is resistance. In this stage, if the stressor continues, the body will continue to try to adapt to it. It tries to cope with the threat. Physiological arousal goes down a bit, but it's still higher than normal. The person might not look particularly stressed out at this point, but if a new stressor happens during this stage, the body won't be able to fight it off. The last stage is exhaustion. In this stage, if the stressor is still going on, the body's energy reserves are depleted and the person can't overcome the threat. This is what Hans says causes illness, especially due to decreased immune functioning. Hans says that the general adaptation syndrome evolved to help people and animals adapt to physical stressors that don't last very long. So basically, acute physical stressors. And in fact, the general adaptation syndrome is extremely effective when used for acute physical stressors, like being chased by a bear or a mugger. However, the problem is that the general adaptation syndrome happens whenever you're stressed. Remember, it's a non-specific effect on the body, so whenever you're stressed, your body is going to respond the same way. So it'll happen when you're being chased by a bear or a mugger, but it'll also happen when you're just sitting in your apartment worrying about your grades. The big problem is if you start running this stress response whenever you have a psychological stressor, again, stressors that tend to be chronic in nature, you'll reach the exhaustion stage pretty often. And this can lead to stress-related illnesses, which we'll talk about in the next video. Sully's book was important because it awakened medicine to the importance of stress, and that stress might be a factor in all illnesses. It provided a way of thinking about the interplay of factors that happen outside the body. However, since Selye worked with rats, he largely ignored psychological factors, so things like beliefs and interpretations, when he thought about stress. He pretty much just looked at all physical things like heat or cold, and he didn't look at anything involving psychological stressors. Now we'll move on to moment 3 in the key moments in the study of stress with Holmes and Rahe. And these researchers looked at things that are stressful to humans. During the 1960s, Holmes and Rahe started looking at the events that humans found stressful. They invented the life events approach to studying stress. Basically, they thought that certain events were unusually stressful, and they thought that the more of those events a person endured throughout their lifetimes, the more likely those people were to get sick. To study this, they asked over 5,000 medical patients about the stressful events in their lives, and from these studies, they found small but consistent relationships between the number of stressful events in someone's life and how often they were sick. And they ranked these events on how stressful they typically were, and actually gave each of these events scores for how stressful these events were. So here's their list. This isn't quite the complete list, but the majority of the 43 events on their list are on here. So just take a moment to peruse it and see if you can notice anything odd about this list. So, I'm sure some of you might have moved and didn't find it stressful at all. I'm sure many of you don't find going on vacation particularly stressful. After all, isn't the point to be relaxed and not stressed? So there are all kinds of things on this list that some people might perceive as stressful, whereas other people might not. One of the oddest things about this list is that it didn't matter whether the event was positive or negative. A lot of positive things are on this list, such as marriage. Or at least for most people, that's a positive event. The reason for this is that Holmes and Rahe believed that the stressfulness of an event was decided merely by how much change it caused in a person's life. So marriage results in a lot of change. Gaining a new family member results in a lot of change. Also, as you read the list, That'll probably strike you pretty quickly that some of these events would be stressful to one person, but not to another person. This seems pretty obvious to us, but as soon as you make this leap, you almost have no choice but to concede that beliefs are important too, which brings us to our next moment in the history of stress. Specifically, Lazarus adds the psychological side of studying stress in humans. Specifically, Lazarus took into account people's beliefs. In other words, psychology. He said that how we perceive and interpret a given event will determine how stressful we find it, and therefore how much it affects us physically. So he said that the key variable isn't necessarily the stressor itself, but rather the individual's perception that he or she is threatened by the stressor. So how we perceive and interpret a given event, which is called a psychological appraisal, how we perceive or interpret each event. So these appraisals will determine how stressful it is to us and what effects it might have on our physical health. So when people approach an event, they go through two kinds of appraisals. First, they have a primary appraisal in which they judge the event as either positive, negative, or neutral. If they judge the event as negative, then they also judge the extent to which they think the event is harmful, threatening, or challenging. Harmful refers to a loss or damage that has already occurred. A threat refers to something that could cause loss or damage, although that loss or damage hasn't yet necessarily occurred. And a challenge refers to a potential for growth or mastery, or some kind of gain. Importantly, if people appraise the event as positive or negative, the process stops. This process only continues if the event is perceived as being negative. After people determine whether this negative event is harmful, threatening, or challenging, they have a secondary appraisal in which they have to determine whether their coping abilities and resources are sufficient to overcome this harm, threat, or challenge posed by the event. These two appraisals together predict how the person responds to the stressor, and in particular, the physiological response the person has, the cognitive response the person has, and the emotional responses that the person has in response to the event. So let's do a brief example to go through this. It's kind of a long process. So suppose you arrive in class during our next meeting time, and I tell you that we're going to have a pop quiz. Importantly, one that you're not necessarily prepared for. A primary appraisal would be when you have first judged it as either positive, negative, or neutral. You might judge it positive if you were quite confident that you knew all the answers to the quiz. If you were, in fact, prepared for the quiz, you might view it positively. You might view it neutrally if, for example, you were auditing the class. So you were taking the class, just sitting in, but not getting a grade, so you didn't really care whether you were going to get a pop quiz or not. And then finally, you could potentially view it as a negative event. So a person might appraise it as negative if they hadn't come to class prepared or paid attention. People who appraise the event as either positive or neutral aren't going to experience any kind of stress. But now consider people who appraised it as negative. Some of those people would have appraised it as presently harmful or threatening for the future, such as damaging your grade. And they probably would feel stressed. But there should also be a few people who appraised it as negative, but also viewed it as a challenge. If you appraise it as a challenge, you would consider this an event that provides opportunities for growth or mastery, an opportunity for learning, or to prove yourself. For the secondary appraisal, you have had to determine whether your coping abilities and your resources are enough to overcome the harm, threat, or challenge posed by this pop quiz. So examples of secondary appraisals might be, I can't do it, I know I'm going to fail. I lack the coping abilities or the resources to deal with this threat, so I'm going to fail. Another example might be, I'll try, but my chances are slim. I don't have a lot of resources or coping abilities, but I'll do my best. Or finally, if you perceive yourself as having plenty of coping abilities and resources, you might be quite confident, I can do this if I just focus. So whether or not something stresses you out depends on how you appraise it, on your thoughts and beliefs about the event. In particular, you'll experience feelings of stress if you appraise the demands in the environment to be greater than your resources. Even if the demands are quite large, you might not feel stressed if you appraise your resources and your coping abilities as being sufficient to meet the demand. So when your environmental demands are greater than your resources and coping abilities, you're going to experience stress. When the environmental demands are less than your resources and coping abilities, you're not going to experience stress. I added this diagram in here. This will be included in your PowerPoint slides just to help walk you through the process. So here we have an event, and we have our primary appraisal in which we appraise the event as either being neutral or positive, at which point the process stops. If we appraise the event as being negative, we then determine whether it's harmful, challenging, or threatening, at which point we enter the secondary appraisal process. Do we have sufficient resources or coping abilities? And depending upon the ratio of the environmental demands to our resources and coping abilities, this is going to influence our cognitive, behavioral, emotional, and physiological responses to that event. A classic study from the 1960s shows that people experience different amounts of stress based simply on how they appraise the stressor. In the study, all the subjects watched a video of a sub-incision. This is a rite of passage for adolescent boys in an unnamed primitive society, in which the underside of the penis is cut deeply from tip to end using a sharp stone. One interesting thing about this study is that they used more than just an undergraduate population, which tends to be the case in psychology studies. About half of the subjects were undergrads, but the other half were airline executives. Why did they pick airline executives specifically? I have no idea. That little detail, I think, has been lost to history. So the subject watched this relatively gruesome video, but they were divided into 4 groups, each of which heard a different narration of the video. One group had no soundtrack. They just saw the images with no sound. Another group had a trauma narrative that emphasized the pain, danger, and lack of sterility during the procedure. A third group had a denial narrative, which denied the pain and potential harm to the boys and described them as willing participants in a joyful occasion who looked forward to the happy conclusion of the ceremony. And the final group had a scientific narrative that encouraged the viewers to watch in a detached manner. So the narrator said things like, "As you can see, the operation is formal, and the surgical technique, while crude, is very carefully followed." They then measured participants' heart rates and self-reported stress. What they found was that subjects who heard the trauma narration had the most stress, the highest heart rate, in other words, followed by the people with no soundtrack. The subjects who had the denial, or scientific narration, reported the least stress, and their heart rates didn't go up even. So what this shows is that how you appraise things, your thoughts and beliefs about the stressor, affects whether or not you have a stress response and the extent of that response. This study also shows that people experience stress even when it doesn't relate to them directly. We can feel vicarious stress if we see other people in stressful circumstances, if we see other people suffering. Now we'll move on to moment 5 and the 6 key moments in the study of stress. Specifically, that threat and challenge are different. So Jim Blaskovich studied the difference between how people respond to threat and how people respond to challenge. He defined challenge as the state where you appraise your resources and demands and decide that your resources are greater than the demand placed on you. He defined threat as the state where you decide that the demands on you are greater than your resources. And he found that each of these states, threat and challenge, had their own distinct physiological response. And we'll talk in the next video about the exact types of responses each of these leads to. But for now, just appreciate that he discovered these psychobiological markers which show that threat and challenge lead to different responses in your body. And now, the 6th and final key moment in the history of the study of stress. Shelley Taylor and her discovery of the tend and befriend response. So it took until relatively recently for researchers to make the discovery that males and females experience and respond to stress differently. In 2000, Shelley Taylor published a hugely influential paper where she challenged the fight-or-flight notion of the stress response that Walter Cannon originated in our first key moment in the study of stress. She didn't say that the fight-or-flight response didn't happen. Instead, she said that while the fight-or-flight response might be the primary physiological response to stress for both males and females, females have a different behavioral response, which she called tend and befriend. So what is this tend and befriend response? Well, tending means engaging in nurturing activities designed to protect the self and one's offspring. These activities promote safety and reduce distress. Befriending means creating and maintaining social networks that might help in the process of tending. Taylor and her colleagues think that this response has evolved through the generations as a successful stress response for females because it protected both women and their children. In her paper, she cites evidence that females are unlikely to fight or to flee in response to stress, and that the fight or flight response is adaptive primarily for males and may be partly activated by testosterone. She then cites evidence, mainly from animal studies, that the female stress response may be activated by oxytocin, which is a pituitary hormone which has been shown to lead to relaxation and maternal behaviors. So, for example, oxytocin is high in nursing mothers. She gives evidence that females are likely to tend or engage in nurturing behaviors in response to stress. She also cites evidence that females have a tendency to befriend or to seek out support of other people when they're stressed. That evidence comes mainly from human studies, showing that, for example, when awaiting a stressful experience in the lab, women prefer to wait with other women, whereas men tend to prefer to wait alone. So why did it take so long to discover the tend and befriend response? And we're going to talk about this throughout this semester, because nearly all of the stress research had been conducted on males. Male people and male rats tend to be more commonly researched, more likely to be research subjects than female people and rats. And we'll talk more about why that is and the consequences of that in future videos.